Hey guys, it's Shaylin. I'm here today with another writing video, and I'm so excited today to be bringing you a craft video. I'm really excited to get back into making some craft content and hopefully to make it even more detailed and just better than ever is my hope. So today's video is on the unity of form and concept. This is actually a video I originally prepared and delivered as a lecture as part of my MFA teaching skills course. I just wrapped up the first semester of my MFA. I took a teaching skills course, which is a course all about teaching writing at the university level. Our final project for this semester was to design a course and to deliver a sample lecture from that course. So I designed a course on experimental forms in fiction. I delivered a lecture that you're going to see today on the unity of form and concept, since I think this is such a foundational idea behind experimental fiction. It's also just such a helpful and foundational idea behind kind of all writing. So this is a really foundational idea behind experimental fiction. Because in experimental fiction, usually we are drawing attention to form more than we would in traditional fiction. Usually experimental fiction plays with form in some way, breaks rules or conventions of form in some way, and that's kind of often what makes it experimental. Not always, but often. Experimental fiction is often more form forward or more form driven. Whereas in traditional fiction, form is usually something that is meant to be kind of invisible. We're not meant to really notice it or pay attention to it. The focus is meant to be on the story. This idea of unity of form and concept applies to both traditional fiction as well as the really experimental fiction and to other forms of writing as well, especially poetry. I'm sure anyone here who writes poetry is very, very familiar with this concept. We're going to talk about the importance of form, how form and concept work together, and ultimately how to make intentional and effective choices with form. So before we talk about the unity of form and concept and how these two things work together, let's talk about them individually. I do want to set the stage for what I mean by these different terms because I'm not necessarily using them under the most common or the most obvious definitions. So first up is concept. Concept is basically just a specific intention you want to express through a piece of writing. Oftentimes when we think of concept, we think of it as like a pitch. I'm writing this story about this character facing this conflict. That might be part of your intention, but your intention could also be a topic, theme, or idea you want to explore. It could be commentary you want to make. It could be a character that you want to study and dissect. It could be an emotion that you kind of want to express and maybe share with the reader. It could be multiple of the above things. It could be something else completely different that I didn't touch on. Essentially, concept is just what you want to say or what you're saying with a piece of work. But obviously, a concept on its own is not a work of fiction. So we need to take our concept and translate it into a story, which is the specifics of the narrative and its events. In most cases, the story is characters moving through space and time and some kind of causally linked chain of events. In some of the most experimental fiction, you may not fall under this specific definition of story, but basically story is just what happens. It's kind of the content. A lot of the time in writing, we talk about unity of form and content, not unity of form and concept. Personally, I like to tweak that and say unity of form and concept because I want to get across this idea that the form is part of the concept, part of the intention. Honestly, both are true. It's unity of form and concept and content. Story is basically just what happens. However, we still do not have a work of fiction. We need to take that story and translate it into words. That's how we get form. Form is the vehicles and techniques that you use to translate the story and concept into words on a page. And that's why form is so important, because without form, we cannot communicate our story to a reader. So form is basically just how you say it. You kind of have the what you want to say in the concept and the story, which I'm going to say story instead of content because that would be really confusing if I kept saying content and concept, and I would inevitably mix the words up because I say the wrong words in videos all the time. If you're writing, say, nonfiction, there may not be a story. But I'm going to say story, but you guys know what I mean. It's content. I want to get across this idea that it's not a dichotomy between what you want to say and how you want to say it. Sometimes they are the same. Sometimes how you say something is part of what you want to say. The how can be the what, and the what can be the how. So that gets us to then the central concept of this video, which is the unity of form and concept. This is the harmonious relationship between the story and the form in order to express your conceptual intentions. So form and content work together, and not only do they work together, they are part of each other. They are the same thing, even in some ways, rather than being two separate aspects of a story. I'm going to put up this really ugly diagram that I made that's pretty ugly. I made this diagram to represent how I think we often intuitively see fiction. Story is in the middle and story is the most important. The things that make up story, character, setting, plot, theme are the most important. Those are the fun things. They're what we're supposed to be paying attention to, and they're what we should care about the most as a writer. Take a shot, or don't, for every time that you've heard someone say character is the most important part of story, or story is more important than prose. I've probably said character was the most important aspect of writing in the past because that sounded like a smart thing to say, and I think I genuinely believed it at that time, but I no longer stand by that statement. So I think a lot of the time we view writing like this: story and the things that make up story are the most important, and then the concept is kind of just like an initial seed for that story, and then there's form off to the side, kind of tucked away. It's the least important thing. We definitely don't want to draw attention to it in our work. So what I would encourage you instead is to view fiction like this. So this is a global view of fiction where story, concept, and form are all of equal importance. And not only are they all of equal importance, but they are all deeply interlinked. All the little sub-ideas that make up character, story, and form. I have a bunch up on the screen, but there's so many more. I had limited space in the diagram. These are just kind of a sampler. They're also all of equal importance. Nothing here is of inherent more importance than anything else. Yes, some people will say character is the most important thing. In a specific work that you want to write, character may be the focal point, and it may be the thing that is at the foreground, but it doesn't mean that it's the most important. Everything here is of equal importance. Even those things that are maybe more in the background in a given work, they're still important. And making frivolous choices with those things can impact your ability to express the things that are more in the foreground of your piece. I often use cooking as an analogy for writing, and I'm gonna do it again. When you cook a dish and you present it to someone for them to eat, they are not going to experience every single ingredient separate from each other. They're just going to take a bite of this whole cohesive dish where all the ingredients work together. Even the ingredients that maybe are not the focal point, maybe they exist in smaller quantity, maybe it's a seasoning that just kind of blends into the dish and the person is probably not even going to identify it. It's still a cohesive part of the dish, and if one element doesn't belong in there or wasn't prepared properly or doesn't go with the other flavors, it can throw off the whole dish. If there's a star ingredient and you don't season it properly, that supporting ingredient, that seasoning, impacts the effectiveness of the whole dish. It's the same with fiction. When someone reads your story, they aren't going to experience the setting separate from the point of view, separate from the plot. They're just going to read one full cohesive story. And it's the same thing if one element is maybe not well chosen, doesn't belong, not well handled. It can throw off the unity of the entire piece. Every element of your story works together. They're all equally important. They're all part of a unified whole. How does this work to convey my core intention for the story? So that gets us to this kind of mantra that I like to say, which is form is concept and concept is structure. And this could honestly go on and on. We could say structure is theme, and theme is character, and character is point of view, and point of view is word choice, and word choice is setting. Every single aspect of your story is a way to express the core of the story, the concept of the story, the intention of the story. It all works together. One thing I really like to remember when talking about the importance of form is to remember that form is the meeting point between a story and its reader. Without form, the reader can't experience your story. Without form, you do not have a work of fiction, right? Your story is just floating in the ether. We need form to communicate a story to a reader. Choices that you make in form are direct expressions of the elements of story, things like the character, the plot, the theme. So a couple examples of choices in form. I had some put up in the diagram earlier, but I just wanted to run through some of the most common elements of form. This is not an exhaustive list. First of all is point of view and tense. Personally, I think point of view and tense usually work together. Like, a first-person past tense is very different from a first-person present tense. I think point of view and tense is one of the clearest places to see how if we change the point of view and tense, so we change this element of form, we've changed the story. Let's say you have a story in mind, and when you think about the story, it takes the shape of a character thinking back to something that happened a decade ago and playing through the events through the lens of memory and maybe unreliability. That is a first-person retrospective. If you were to write it in third-person present tense, not only have you changed the form, you've completely changed the mode of the story. It's now a different story. Point of view is what the story is. It's the inherent mode of the story. It's the relationship between the character and the story. So it doesn't matter which qualities and pros and cons of first person you want. It's just, is your story first person? Or is it third person? Or is it second person? It's not about picking based on a list of qualities that may not even apply to your story in a specific case you have. It's just a matter of asking, what is the story? Then there's formatting. So this is something that we have standards and conventions for. But as a result, because we have standards and conventions for formatting, when you start to break those standards and conventions, you signal to the reader that they have to reframe and relearn how to read the story. Formatting is actually a really important tool when it comes to writing experimental fiction, especially because you can break standards and conventions of formatting in order to signal to the reader that they need to change their learned habits of how to read and interpret a story. Then we get to word choice. Word choice is kind of an example of microform. Every single time you select a word, that's a choice in form. Anyone here who's written poetry is, I bet, intimately familiar with how laborious, but also critical selecting every word can be, and how sometimes changing one word in a poem to a synonym can dramatically change the whole poem. And I think that as fiction writers, we should aspire to have that same level of care. If you've ever written a sentence and gone, that is not the right word, and fallen down a thesaurus rabbit hole for 20 minutes trying to find the right word, that's because you knew on an intuitive level that you, or maybe a conscious level, that you didn't have unity of form and concept. You had a concept you wanted to express through this sentence. It wasn't conveying through the word that you had selected, and so you had to tweak it in order to have unity of form and concept. Then we have also things like spelling, grammar, and punctuation. Much like formatting, we have rules and conventions and standards for these things. So when you break them intentionally and in pattern, it signals to a reader that they need to relearn and reframe how they read the story. A great example I can think of this is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I put an excerpt of this actually on my experimental form syllabus for the week on micro-experimentation because of the way that she plays with punctuation style. She doesn't use periods, she uses line breaks. And I remember reading the first page of that book and being like, how am I going to get through this? This is like a 500-page book and there are no periods. This is going to be maddening to read. And by the end of page 2, my brain had kind of reformed and reshaped how to read it. And it became so natural and it had such a beautiful and effortless rhythm that I flew through the book. When I went back to reading the book with like standard punctuation, I was like, this feels so wrong and clunky and has no musicality to it whatsoever. Then we have all forms of structure, all the way from sentence and paragraph structure up to scene, chapter, or section structure, all the way up to the big one, story structure. How you structure your story is one of the biggest, well, quite literally biggest formative choices you'll make because it's kind of in the macro form. We think of structure as this Freytag's pyramid shape, right? Where we have like an establishing beat and then the inciting incident, rising action, maybe a midpoint identified in the middle, a climax, and then a falling action, maybe a denouement. We often think of story structure as this shape. It's the most common way that story structure is taught. This is a very culturally ingrained Western story structure template. It's something that's kind of ingrained, often intuitive maybe. That doesn't mean that it's the only way to structure a story or the best way to structure a story. The question is not, when you're figuring out how you want to structure your piece, how do I make my story fit this shape? It's, what shape is my story? Just like with point of view, if you change the structure, you change the story. Changing how you structure a story kind of changes the story. It completely changes the effect of the story, and a lot of that can come down to how you handle things like time and linearity. You completely change the effect of the work when you change how you structure it. Telling a story linearly from beginning to end versus beginning halfway through and dispersing the first half throughout with flashback completely changes the effect of the piece and what the focus is on, how reveal and momentum and tension work. It becomes like a completely different book. So that gets us to the importance of making intentional choices. Because form is so important, we want to be making the most intentional choices as possible with form. Intentional can also be intuitive. Just because I'm using the word intentionality a lot here, I don't mean you have to have all the answers before you even start writing. As a known discovery writer, that would be hypocritical of me, and it's not how I write. I'm like a writer who's very form forward in my work, not just because my work tends to be like form forward in the final work, but like that's how I work. I start from form. I often start from like the shape the story is going to take on the page, the point of view, and like the place the narrative is coming from, and a feeling that I want to capture through the form. That's often my starting place. I often intuitively know what choices I want to make with form, and I don't know why I'm making them until I'm midway through the book or even finish the book. Occasionally I start writing the book and I realize that I made the wrong formative choices and I have to reframe, but most of the time that intuitive decision ends up being right. I just don't know why yet. Everyone works in different ways, but I just wanted to say that just because I'm saying that you should make intentional choices with form, don't be afraid to run with a choice in form. Even if you can't explain it right from the start, you might just know that it's right, and its reason will reveal itself to you. Or it might just naturally bake itself into the piece in an inherently critical way. Some people might want to make all these choices in advance and know exactly what they mean and exactly what they're doing, but sometimes some writers work more intuitively, and that is also okay. I would say there's a difference between listening intuitively to what the story wants and the shape the story wants to take, and relying on cultural defaults about story. There are Western cultural defaults about story, like Freytag's pyramid, even things like third person past tense. There's a difference between knowing intuitively, my story needs to be in a 3-act structure, that is the shape of the story, and figuring out through the process why that is, versus just automatically defaulting to that without interrogating it in any way. So I'm asking you to try and think more intentionally, but that intention doesn't have to come before the writing process. It can come from an intuitive place. It can happen throughout. So this main idea that I'm getting at throughout this whole video is that we can do extra work in content, so things like character, theme, plot, by expressing these things through the story's vehicle. You're able to extract so much more nuance and so much more complexity from your work when you use form as a means to develop it rather than just the story elements. Let's talk about character development, for example. How would we develop character through story? That would be things like the character's actions and decisions on the page, their interactions with other characters, their dialogue, backstory, even like their internal thoughts, their character arc. These are all fantastic ways of developing character. But what if we use story alongside form? What if we also then use, say, word choice and syntax in order to build a strong sense of voice and personality and even context for the character from the very first sentence? Maybe we can also use things like sentence structure and punctuation in order to kind of create a pattern of thought and really bring us into the character's mind in a very close way. Maybe we want to think about how we're going to structure the story in order to convey how the character experiences the story. Maybe we want to think about what point of view and tense we want to use in order to best access our character's psychology. These are all choices in form. And now that we're using the form alongside the story, we don't have to pick one or the other. We can use both simultaneously. We're going to get such richer character depth and character work out of the piece than if we were just using story on its own. So a couple examples of intentional choices in form. These are just 3 examples out of infinite possibilities. Choosing a point of view or tense to reflect your character's relationship to the narrative or reveal something about their psyche. Structuring a piece to center a certain emotion, experience, or moment, or selecting word choice to build character world or ground the story in reality or unreality. There are infinite different examples of this. Think about an intentional choice that you've made in form in your own writing, or maybe something you've encountered in your reading, and share it in the comments if you would like. Before we get into some examples, I wanted to touch on this idea of creating a character psychology and, by extent, a reader experience. We can use choices in form to recreate the way the character experiences the story and the way the character feels, and to extend that to the reader. So the reader also then experiences the story the way the character does and feels the way the character does. We don't always have to do this. Sometimes the reader experience is very different from the character experience, but one way we can use form is to recreate the way the character thinks, feels, and experiences the story. One example that comes to mind is this book, Thirst by Marina Yasuzuka, translated by Heather Cleary, probably because I just read it, so it's fresh in my mind. This is a book about a vampire, and the first half of the book is written as this kind of long, dreamlike episode that simultaneously feels like we're on fast forward and also like nothing is really happening. Like time is moving both really quick and really slow all at once. And I thought that this brilliantly captured an experience of living for centuries without forming any meaningful connections. Time moves so quickly for this character, but at the same time, nothing is really happening. It's not always the case that we want to use the form to recreate how the character feels or how they experience the story, but it can be. I think it can be a beautiful example of kind of like using form as an empathetic tool to really extend the emotions and experience of the story to the reader. So now we're going to look at 2 examples. So this first example is from a short story called Insta by Kelsey Lauder. We're just going to read the opening section. I'll read the opening section, but I'll leave the entire story linked in the description if you'd like to read it. It's not very long, and it's a really fun example of experimental fiction that is also quite accessible. 620 of 623. You're 16, white blonde hair, narrow face, full tooth smile. A reproduction of your mother's high school photos. You stand in the center of a group of teenagers, all beautiful. You're in a purple velvet dress, sheer black tights running up your thighs. You lean forward, laughing, hair swung forward to partially obscure your face. Your arm is around Leah, darling Leah, your best friend in her sparkly champagne dress and knee-high boots. You wear a thin chain around your neck with a long gold bar that trails down your breastbone. Leah's necklace cuts across her with 3 horizontal strikes. Around you, the rest of the kids lean in, bodies pressed together. One girl kisses a boy's cheek. Another scrunches her face into a silly smile. They are feral despite the careful curation of their clothes. Their eyes all stare into the camera's lens with an urgent hunger. Except you, who looks down to your knees and folds into the other bodies. At gem_cities. Insta meetup. So many amazing people here tonight. Some I've only met in real life for the first time. Can you believe that all these guys are even more gorgeous in person? I've fallen in love a half dozen times already. Everything is more fun when you've got great clothes on and music to dance to. At Leah Lovebird and I are wearing necklaces by at Lola Jewels, dressed by at Vinty. Check out Leah at JJ Katie Pie, at S Craig, at LeBlanc, at John Wilhelmina, and too many other names to remember for outfit info. Also, don't forget to tune in tonight to my mom's interview for New York Art Beat. I'm going to sneak outside and watch on my phone. There's a few different formative choices being made here. The first one I wanted to highlight is the second person. This feels like a really intuitive use of second person because the story takes the form of photographs. So it's the main character looking at herself in photographs, so she has become a you. It's her describing pictures of herself, so there's like that element of dissociation of looking at yourself, of becoming a you. There's also this kind of found footage style. The story is formatted like an Instagram feed. We have these photo-shaped single paragraph descriptions of the photos, followed by the captions underneath, and the whole story is like this. There's no other narrative outside this format. Just kind of bringing the concept into the formatting. This is a story that's very much about like superficiality and the real people and real emotions underneath that superficiality and our relationships to these kind of constructed superficial versions of ourselves. And as the story goes on, we start to see a little bit more emotion and internal narrative slip into these descriptions of the photographs. Towards the end, those descriptions of the photos kind of whittle down and become only a few sentences to even just one sentence. The importance of the image is kind of disappearing and the focus is just put on her thoughts. Kind of this like formative arc to the piece. And the final thing I wanted to note is the nonlinear structure. You can't tell just from this excerpt, but the story is very nonlinear. 620 of 623 signals it's the 620th photo on her Instagram, and from there on, we jump around nonlinearly. The shape of this story is not a Freytag's pyramid. It's not a story about forward narrative motion in a linear series of events. It's more of a spiral. We slowly kind of circle down the drain until we get to the core of the story. So I've got another example. This is Turing Test by Franny Choi, which is a poem. I wanted to include a poem in this video as an example because I think the idea of unity of form and concept is often easier to identify in poetry because that's like such a foundation of what poetry is, and poets don't shy away from this, from form, the way sometimes fiction writers feel the instinct to. It's the first in a series of poems that form kind of the structure of her book Soft Science, which is a book that uses cyborgs and robots and androids, any kind of like humanoid machine hybrid to explore the core theme of the fetishization of Asian women. So I'm just going to read the beginning of this poem, but again, I'll leave the full poem linked in the description. It's totally worth the read, and if you like the poem, her book Soft Science is like banger after banger of incredible, inventive, speculative poetry. This is a test to determine if you have consciousness. Do you understand what I am saying? In a bright room, on a bright screen, I watched every mouth, duck, duck, roll. I learned to speak from puppets and smoke, orange worms twisted into the army's alphabet. I caught the letters as they fell from my mother's mouth, whirlpool, sword, wolf. I circled countable nouns in my father's science papers, sodium bicarbonate, NBCN1, amino acid. We stayed up, practiced saying, girl, 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 till our mouths grew soft. Yes, I can speak your language. I broke in that horse myself. Does anyone know how to say the name of that chemical compound? It has been a solid decade since my high school chemistry days, and I do not remember. What formative choices are being made here? First of all, we have the interview format. She's playing with this idea of the Turing test, which is a series of questions that you would ask a computer to determine if it had become sentient. In this case, though, she's kind of inverting that idea, where the questions are being used to undermine her humanity and undermine her autonomy and try to prove that she isn't human, even though we can feel so much emotion and we can really feel the humanity in the piece. To me, this changes the level of consent the poem is operating on. She's not speaking of her own volition to speak. She's being demanded, questioned, almost like interrogated, and it kind of gives the poem like an aggressive tone towards the speaker, kind of makes her feel confronted, even trapped. We also have the lack of capitalization, which you see a lot in contemporary poetry. A lot of contemporary poets kind of just eschew capitalization. Here it makes sense thematically, I think, because of this smallness of identity. To me, it also just adds to this feeling of it looking like a transcript, even though transcripts would use capital letters. I don't know why in my brain it makes it look more like a transcript. And then finally, we have the use of slashes instead of standard punctuation. She kind of puts the speaker's answers in this kind of prose poem format where it's like slashed apart. To me, this kind of like chops up the narrative flow, so it kind of feels like a consciousness being dissected and taken apart. She's never able to get a full thought out, especially when you compare it to the interviewer who speaks in these long, full sentences. It almost creates a sense of like power imbalance. There's like a calmness to the interviewer, whereas the speaker is kind of being like taken apart, disarranged, and almost there's like a panic, a kind of frayed consciousness that's really interesting. That's how I interpreted the slashes. I was really curious how Franny Choi interpreted the slashes, so I was able to find an interview with her. Reading interviews with authors whose work you admire is one of the best ways to learn about writing and open your mind to what an intentional choice in writing and in form looks like. We can only infer so much, but hearing it from the author themselves about like why they made this choice and what they were intending and the effect they wanted can be so illuminating. So this is an interview she did about this poem. It's in the Adroit Journal. I'll leave the entire interview linked below. It's absolutely worth the read. It's not very long. Highly recommend reading the poem than reading this interview, but I just wanted to highlight this one section where she talks about the slashes. So she says, I'm not always sure if the I of this poem is me. It usually is, but there are parts it splits off from me and starts to become someone else. Maybe this is partly because the English of this poem is broken, though only literally. Those slashes are a technology I learned from Sam Sachs and Jan Beatty, among others. I liked the way they chunked the sentences into pieces, made them objects I could lay down like blocks. They made it easier to change the sentence as I went, made the language something I could gather and manipulate rather than asking it to bear the burden of coherence. They helped the poem become a machine I built piece by piece, a hybrid voice constructed with objects and animated by the spookiness of personhood. There are lots of ways to be a cyborg without being a cyborg, is what I'm saying. So I just found this really interesting, how she talks about how this actually helped her with her writing process, how this was a tool for her to actually write the poem, not just for the end result, which can often be true of form. Sometimes formative choices are for you as much as they are for the reader. When I initially did this lecture, it was shorter because I had a time constraint and I had to rein it in. It was a 20-minute lecture followed by a 15-minute discussion. This is YouTube. We cannot have a discussion, but I wanted to try and recreate that as best as possible. So there's going to be a follow-up video to this, hopefully in the next month, where we're going to look at a longer example. So the story that we're going to look at is 10 excerpts from an annotated bibliography on the cannibal women of Randabar Island by Nivedita Sen. I'm obsessed with this story. It is quite short. It's a really exciting, fresh example of experimental fiction, speculative experimental fiction. I'll be looking at that story and breaking it down, much like my video where I broke down Los Angeles by Ling Ma, so going through the story line by line and talking about it. But I'm gonna leave a Google form in the description. So what I would encourage you guys to do is read the story in advance, just like you would for a class. And I've got a couple very loose prompts about form in the story and how form is used. They're not like questions, there's no right or wrong answer, it's just to kind of get you thinking. You can submit your thoughts on these prompts and I will share them in the next video so we can kind of have a class discussion. So I'll leave the Google form as well as the story linked below. It's such a cool story. Even if you don't feel like contributing to the video, I do highly recommend giving it a read because it's one of my favorite short stories I've read recently and it's just such a cool example of experimental speculative fiction. So that's all for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that this is helpful and something that you can take into your writing. This is kind of a universal idea. It applies to basically every piece of writing in some way or another. Thank you guys so much for watching and I'll see you in another video. Bye!